The horror and superhero genres have often collided, either in genre pieces such as Blade, Hellboy and Swamp Thing, or in crossovers such as Batman vs Predator. These two fandoms seem to go hand in hand with each other, and this can be seen in the filmography of certain directors who have dabbled in both genres. With Brightburn, a collaboration between James Gunn and David Yarovesky, set for release in late June, I wanted to take a look at some of the best crossover directors, those who can make us wish we were a caped crusader and then remind us that the world is scary and we should really be hiding under our duvets. Here are some of the best directors who have worked in both the horror and comic book genre. Rachel Talalay. This is the woman who brought us Tank Girl, the cult classic that flaunted a crude, anarchic rebel and a mutant kangaroo. Before bringing us this little gem, Talalay was battling the almighty Freddy Krueger, producing A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, and then directing one of its sequels, Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. Since then, Talalay has kept her feet firmly planted in both worlds by directing episodes of Supergirl, Legends of Tomorrow and The Flash, alongside Supernatural, Riverdale and Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. This is a woman who can definitely do both. Zack Snyder. Snyder's name is synonymous with comic book films and a certain style that is just as distinguishable as it is opinion-splitting amongst movie watchers. His filmography includes 300, Watchmen, Man of Steel, Batman vs Superman, and of course, Justice League. However, his career started with a love letter to the legendary Romero. Snyder's Dawn of the Dead showed his horror love to the world, and this love is going to lead to his follow-up film, Army of the Dead. Slow motion zombies, anyone? Tim Burton. So this was an obvious choice, right? Burton has always had a dark and gothic style, and that has lended itself perfectly to both the tales of horror and the graphic imagery of superhero films. This is the man who took Batman from the swinging 60s into the industrial 90s with Batman and Batman Returns. His signature horror style has spanned across animated features such as Corpse Bride and Frankenweenie, whilst also beautifully portraying the obscure in Sleepy Hollow and Beetlejuice. Burton brings the quirky fantasy to horror and the eccentric to superheroes. Guillermo del Toro. The Oscar-winning King of Creatures is another example of horror legend who can make one hell of a comic book film. Del Toro has offered some of the most visually stunning fantasy horror films, including The Devil's Backbone, Pan's Labyrinth and Crimson Peak, all demonstrating his stunning monster designs in full force. His comic book films are no different, with Blade 2 offering a new take on the vampire visual, and Hellboy 1 and 2 creating a fantastical world of good guy creatures versus villainous monsters. Del Toro's films transcend language and are artful, horrific, and beautiful in equal measures. Sam Raimi. Raimi crashed onto the horror scene with the campy, gory, and chin-filled Evil Dead series that has since carved its own corner of the horror fandom. The original Evil Dead became a cult classic, and its follow-up requel upped the ante with more blood, more slapstick, and a chainsaw. Army of Darkness cemented Raimi as a cult darling, with comedic undertones and one hell of a boomstick. Raimi's next big venture was to direct the Spider-Man trilogy and bring nerdy Peter Parker to life. I mean, we won't get too far into Spider-Man 3 Parker Goes Emo, but the series really rejuvenated young Spidey and offered charm and heart aplenty. Raimi returned to horror after Spider-Man and did not disappoint with the gross-out curse film Drag Me to Hell, which managed to tread the thin line of hilarious and terrifying, the usual Raimi mix. Joss Whedon. The man who decided that it was about time the pretty blonde cheerleader fought back against the monsters. Whedon is a horror and comic book master. His big break came when he created his first TV series, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the supernatural coming-of-age story that influenced a generation of viewers and is just as popular now as it ever was. Buffy boasts some of the scariest creatures ever put to television and is a clear love letter to classic horror. Since creating Buffy, Whedon has gone on to become a game changer in the MCU, putting his stamp on the Avengers and the Avengers Age of Ultron. His unique script style is clear in some of the other MCU movies as well, bringing a certain flavour to the universe. Whedon also wrote and produced one of the best horror comedy films, The Cabin in the Woods, which is a treasure trove of self-referential humour and twisted genre tropes. As an unashamed Scooby myself, I just have to say, thank you, Joss Whedon. Neville and Taylor. Mark Neville and Brian Taylor are a filmmaking duo who have dabbled across horror and comic book films with some hits and some misses. They worked as writers for Jonah Hex, and they directed Ghost Rider, Spirit of Vengeance. But they kind of knocked it out of the park with their adaptation of the comic book series Happy, an amazingly odd dark comedy with an animated talking unicorn. And I mean, if that doesn't sell you on it, what will? The pair have also worked in the horror genre, directing an exorcism movie, The Vatican Tapes, and an insane horror comedy, Mum and Dad. I'm so glad they got to work with Nick Cage again, and it worked out much better for them this time. Scott Derrickson. Derrickson's directing career seemed to be on a pure horror path from its origins in Hellraiser Inferno up to his original and spectacular film Sinister. That is until 2016 when he became the director of Doctor Strange. A horror darling, Derrickson also directed The Exorcism of Emily Rose and was the writer of Sinister 2. He'll be amping up his comic book resume in 2021 when he directs the Doctor Strange sequel, bringing more of the titular master of mystic arts to our screens. John Watts. This man has managed to have on his filmography one of the most disturbingly weird horror films and one of the brightest and happiest comic book films. Watts went from directing Clown, the tale of a man possessed by an evil clown costume, to bringing Tom Holland's Spider-Man to the big screen. Now, if that isn't a genre leap, I don't know what is. Watts is a man who really goes after the projects he wants to create. He directed a fake trailer for his film idea Clown and brazenly included an announcement that it was being produced by Eli Roth, who was definitely not involved at the time, but did become a producer soon after seeing it. He also got a Spider-Man tattoo on his chest to increase his chances of being the director of Homecoming, and it bloody worked. This man is ballsy and can really work within both genres. I look forward to Far From Home and whatever horror fare he approaches next. I wonder what he does to get his next job. Taika Waititi. The man who saved a Norse god from the dark world, Taika Waititi is responsible for the best Thor film we have seen so far, Thor Ragnarok. His humour and pacing bring new life to the character, who was a little bit out of favour after his second offering to the MCU. Before becoming the man behind the haircut, he wrote, produced and directed the most hilarious horror mockumentary film, What We Do in the Shadows. Smattered with brilliant to-camera confessionals, perfect production design and a ridiculously scored chase scene, this really is a standout horror comedy. The film was so good that they have made a TV series based upon it that Waititi has been involved with. We needed more and he delivered. James Wan. With a whole universe named after him, James Wan is clearly set up as a household horror name. His horror career started with his directorial debut Saw, based on a short film that he co-created with his frequent collaborator Lee Winnell. Since then he has developed his own signature style across multiple other films, including Dead Silence, an often underrated film, Insidious 1 and 2, and the first two Conjuring films. His latest directing role brought him slightly out of the darkened rooms of haunted house films and saw him tackle a DC comic book hero. Aquaman shed light on what had been a gritty franchise while still offering some clear horror influence, the scene in the trench being a perfect example. It was so successful visually that a horror-tinged spin-off has been announced with Wan producing the film. He continues to work as a producer on the Conjuring Universe films and clearly has more to offer as both a horror and comic book filmmaker, helming the 2022 Aquaman sequel as well. David F. Sandberg. A newcomer to the director's chair, but one who has managed to pack a lot of punches into his 3 feature films. Sandberg rose to fame after the release of his 2013 short film, Lights Out, which went on to be his directorial debut. His eerie atmospherics translated well into his next film, Annabelle Creation, which managed to salvage the creepy doll after her first solo outing film was an overall dud. His latest film venture is the brilliant new addition to the DCEU, bringing the flossing teenage superhero Shazam to the big screen. Sandberg created a light, funny and thoroughly entertaining entry to this often dark and gritty universe, yet still managed to keep some of his horror roots in there. The 7 deadly sins are the creatures of nightmares. His filmography is predominantly short films that he created before getting his big break with Lights Out, and since then his 2 follow-ups have had me wanting for more. James Gunn. Now the man of the hour. Gunn began his career as a screenwriter on films such as Scooby-Doo and Sam Raimi's Dawn of the Dead, before venturing into directing himself with his debut film Slither. With Slither, Gunn is clearly flaunting his love of B-movie horror tropes and manages to walk the line of body horror and gross-out comedy to create a brilliant cult horror film. After this, we were offered Super, another black humour cult film that explores the breakdown of one character and his decision to become a powerless superhero. This tone shift still holds the graphic elements from Slither while pushing forward on the comic book humour. It was a perfect stepping stone to Gunn's amazing entry into the MCU with the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy. Now that we have this ragtag group of criminal guardians, it's hard to imagine the universe without them, but a lot of that would not have been possible without the tone, humour and direction that Gunn brought to the film. I'm glad he's back for Volume 3, and I'm intrigued to find out what he does with the Suicide Squad film as well. Gunn is clearly a geek for both horror and comic books, and this shines through in his filmography. So those are some of my picks of the best crossover directors who clearly can and should do both. Hope you've enjoyed, and if I've missed any rising stars within the genres, please let me know in the comments.